Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are in this world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for the event, and I welcome you. We have a great webinar on tap today, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you'll be able to access the webinar on demand. We'll be sending out an email post-event that will contain a link to take you to the webinar on demand. We'll also be taking questions from the audience, so if at any time during our presentation you have a question for the panelists, please don't delay, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions, and we'll take probably around 10 or 15 minutes near the end of the presentation and go through those questions. Okay, with that, I'd like to go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is, are your containers as secure as you think? We have a few, three really great webinar panelists today. Our speakers are Matthew Harkrider, who's the Senior Technical Product Manager at AlertLogic, and John Norden, who is the Release Director at AlertLogic. And they're going to be joined later on in the webinar by Tyson Malik, who's Senior Manager, DevOps Cloud Release and Middleware Engineering at Rent-A-Center. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Good to be here.
Great, great. Yep. So, John, I understand you're going to be driving the slides, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it right over to you.
Certainly. So, thank you very much. So, as she said, I'm John Norden. I'm a Release Director here with AlertLogic. I've had many different roles within the company. Currently, my responsibility kind of is to deliver all of our software releases from vision through development and into implementation. And prior to that, I ran our infrastructure for quite some time. And I'm also the architect of our company's internal DevOps methodologies and practices. So today, what we're going to kind of cover is a handful of different topics. We're going to talk specifically first through our container journey. So we'll step into that. Really, we're a lot like any other SaaS company out there when it comes to infrastructure. Managing it, keeping costs under control, making sure it supports the demand of being able to deploy software at high velocity. And I'd like to kind of share some key bits of information with you all to kind of help set the scope for the the problem that we specifically even have. So as I said, we're a SaaS-based company, so our infrastructure is pretty expansive. We run a microservices architecture where we have over 150 different microservices in operation today, and that number grows constantly. We are a continuous deployment environment. We see anywhere from 10 to 50 deployments a day that are all hands-off, 100% automated. And we must ensure that we are operating a secure kind of infrastructure so that our automation has built-in gates to kind of help us ensure security is part of our ecosystem from the beginning. So like I said, we're like any other SaaS company. We always have to find ways to scale, improve our deployment capabilities, and we have to do all of that while we're trying to save costs. So the struggle is real, and there's definitely no shortage of challenges. So in our case, because we're a pretty good example of a company that has needed to move to containers anyway, we were spending a tremendous amount of money in our budget on infrastructure on both hardware and operational complexity. And our service deployment times were pretty high. They were 30 minutes to an hour to complete, and it's a pretty painful experience for internal developers. So in our case, we needed to invest in some infrastructure that would allow us to gain as much ground and cost control and deployment velocity as possible without requiring a ton of infrastructure work and complicated migrations. So we kind of landed on the decision that migrating the mass of our workload to containers would allow us the flexibility that we needed to reduce our spend, increase our deployment velocity, and truly tackle the scalability of our services. So, when you look at kind of why containers, so for us, it seemed to be a very natural progression to provide us a way to vastly simplify our infrastructure into a better microservices architecture that could take advantage of auto-scale capabilities. So for us, the microservices part was key. This microservices charge that we took allowed us to adhere to simple principles of a service doing one thing well and one thing only. So once those kind of microservices we had were containerized, we found that the services themselves were small enough, simple enough that we could run dozens on a single instance within a container cluster. So this really validated our idea that the move to containers would not only simplify our infrastructure, but would greatly reduce our footprint and save us money in the end. So we pushed on container path, transformed most of our infrastructure where microservices ran into a container-based solution. And the move to containers allowed us to kind of reduce our infrastructure spend considerably, vastly reduced our deployment time, and then allowed us to introduce true auto-scaling to our services. So at the completion of this, effort and us migrating to containers, some of the numbers that we were able to kind of see were pretty impressive. We reduced the spend on that part of our infrastructure by well over 40%, reduced our deployment time by over 90% for services. We went from 30 minutes to an hour to, a minute, 2 minutes for services deployed. And now, we're big consumers of containers. And at any given time, we've got between 200 and 250 container hosts that are running anywhere between 2,500 and 5,500 containers. And that was great. It boded well for us, but now, we need to secure it. So just like everybody else, we have to secure this stuff. So as we kind of sat back and we marveled at what we'd accomplished with the scalability, portability, and all that great stuff moving to containers, we knew we needed to secure it. And we had some very specific use cases that we wanted to secure. And interestingly enough, us being our own consumer of our security services, it kind of led us to help us build out the container security solutions we have in place today. So our requirements were pretty simple, but they were aggressive. And they were mostly built around, that we hold dear to our hearts the philosophy that we have to have frictionless deployment for software and services. So we decided and we set some requirements that kind of specify that any security solution that we deploy must be simple and fit within our container deployment model. Again, no friction there. Any solution we deploy must be deployed just like any other container in our ecosystem, with the expectation that we did not want to build it, we wanted to consume it. And any solution we deploy must not be a major consumer of resources. We moved to containers so that we could save on resources. So CPU and RAM are crucial to us. And any solution we deploy must be deployed where it provides security value immediately on deployment. We didn't want to wait around. We wanted to make sure that we were secure the moment we deployed. So lo and behold, the Alert Logic container security solution was born. The good thing about this is that what came out of it was very simple image-based deployment, required no manual intervention for us to deploy it, simply deployed as just like any other container we have deploys. Took a very minimal footprint in our infrastructure, requiring only one container per container host we wanted to protect. And then we immediately began seeing the security value of it being deployed. So let's kind of start talking a little bit now about why we think network intrusion detection is so critical. So we'll walk through a couple slides here and we'll talk through that. So why a network IDS? Well, the purpose for these is to capture traffic so that you can analyze it at the deepest level and truly understand any suspicious activity that's happening, at the packet level itself. This allows us to kind of build an event story over time that leads to the definition of what an incident is, or whether or not a security incident actually occurred. We can look back at older events, draw thoughtful security conclusions about what occurred. So it's very, very helpful. So when we combine this with like log collection and analytics, this allows us to kind of build a very clear understanding about what happened during a security incident and exactly how impacted your total environment was. And this is very critical in being able to look across, not just your container infrastructure, but your infrastructure as a whole, to avoid really any blind spots in your overall security posture. So the next slide, we'll talk about, what it means to kind of monitor and analyze the traffic and why that is so important for us. So, if you look at back why network is IDS or why network IDS is important, a big part of that is we want to be able to monitor and analyze a lot of that traffic. So what we have to do is we have to build this solution that allows us to kind of monitor all this traffic that we see in a multi-directional manner. So that means whether it's north, south, east, or west, we have to be able to capture it and analyze it. And the good thing about us and with our container solution is that we're able to achieve that because we bind at the lowest level with that Docker ZIL level so that we can capture all of the traffic that comes across any of these hosts for deep analysis. And then this solution then turns into a very simple mechanism for being able to monitor what is happening across the container network, regardless of what overlay is involved. So from here, I'll hand it over to Matt, and he'll continue us on this journey talking about containers.
Yeah, John, thank you very much. Again, my name is Matthew Harkrider. I'm a senior technical product manager here at Logic. I'm also the founder of the company, and have been here a long time and seen the evolution of network-based attacks change quite a bit. And considering the products and services that we offer, we've been asked by our customers to solve this problem. Many of our customers that were getting into the container side of deployments were looking at being able to, really kind of figure out what they didn't know. Security around containers was sort of an afterthought, which it tends to be with a lot of technologies that come out. So people were doing some of the fundamental things like collecting logs and trying to figure out, if there's something dangerous that were in the logs, but they really didn't have any logic to apply to that. There were solutions out there that would do things like process monitoring, which is important. They would do traffic monitoring so we can see increases or decreases in traffic. But we weren't really seeing anybody bring really packet inspection to the table. So there was the chance that we were really missing a lot of attacks and really finding things out well after the fact if we found them out at all. And it really speaks to the fact that you really don't have an opportunity to solve a security problem with one point solution. You have to go out there and look at a layered defense model. So, intrusion detection is one piece of that, but all these things I just kind of talked about real at a high level, like traffic monitoring, configuration management, vulnerability scanning, all these different things kind of complete the suite for how you can have a defense in depth approach to capturing containers. Now, specific to things like intrusion detection, I can give you an example of how it helped us protect a customer who was actually getting themselves into some trouble with some configuration issues that ultimately led to a breach before they deployed our technology. So it's really a story of how we detected that breach almost immediately after they deployed our container, which was a big win for us. But back in February of this year, we started seeing crypto mining threats that were targeting applications that utilized the Monero cryptocurrency. And when we started seeing that activity, we built and released new content in our library so that our intrusion detection technology could detect that, create events and incidents for it, and then we could escalate those issues to our customers. Now, about a month or so after that, we started seeing things in the wild, both in our own customer environments and also just with third-party, information sharing that we do with other security organizations. We noticed that the Monero mining was going on, and it was hitting a lot of Kubernetes kubelets nodes in particular. So, a lot of people were doing a lot of mining with containers, and Kubernetes is probably about the most popular container platform that's out there that many of our customers are working with. So we had some folks that we know over at Medium who noticed the same thing, and they actually published a blog on the topic the following week, which I'll talk about that in just a second. But as you can see, in April, we were almost immediately able to discover these miners in one of our customer environments, and I'm going to get into that a little bit as well. So in terms of the blog that I mentioned on Medium, it really detailed how this person's organization had been hacked via similar Monero mining attack. And in that blog, he described how, very much in the same way that we were observing, that the default scenario for Kubernetes in terms of configuration and networking was just not secure. Ultimately, the Kubernetes endpoint remained unauthenticated and open to the world by default, which is definitely not something that you want to see. And that is almost the exact same thing that happened to our customer as well. Fortunately, they were able to bring us in to help try to identify the issue that was going on and move them past that. So back in December of December 2017, this customer had created some new Kubernetes nodes, and they had been using them when they needed to deploy new nodes. So they've been reusing the same nodes over and over again. Somebody, in the course of this evolution, a few months later, had modified a security group in the configuration that allowed inbound access to that cluster, which is another huge mistake. And that's one thing that you could catch with configuration auditing, but it certainly was missed in this case. And we see this happen all the time. I'm sure that many of you on the call see this happen in your own environments. You've probably had, whether it's in the cloud, whether it's on premise. I mean, people make changes to network environments all the time, and sometimes they open holes they don't realize. Well, in March, they deployed some new nodes, and within about 28 minutes of those new nodes being deployed, somebody had already deployed miners on it. So it happened pretty quickly. Attackers are constantly scanning for open ports and looking for ways they can take advantage of that. That's been around as long as the internet, basically. So the same thing applies here. Attackers are looking for opportunities, and this was definitely an opportunity-based attack. There was no monitoring in place in this environment at the time. We were not really working with this customer at this point. So this had actually been going on for 26 days after the compromise. So April 3rd is around the time that they deployed our container in their environment. And at that same time, they actually started up another node. Within 4 hours of that new node being started up, it was actually breached. And we detected that breach within 6 seconds, which was a big win for us because we were able to see how fast we were actually able to detect the activity. So we were able to identify where that attack was. We were able to escalate the issue. We were able to get that thing taken offline very quickly. Because they were using the same Kubernetes nodes, they were actually able to fix it really in one place and roll things out. So it's kind of the same thing with images. If they see if there's a vulnerability identified, they fix it at the image level and they roll it out to production from there. So it's the same kind of thing here. They were able to fix those nodes that they were reusing very quickly, modify the configuration settings. We were actually able to look at some logs as well, and determine retroactively that other nodes had been breached prior to us deploying our technology as well. So then they deployed the container really production wide and have been using it ever since then. So it was this was really early on when we were actually doing a beta of our own container. So it was really the first version of our container that identified this attack, which was great. And we've done a lot of work to it since then to broaden the capabilities, because intrusion detection is one component of things that you want to do, whether you're talking about containers or you're talking about other portions of your network. It may not make sense everywhere, but it certainly does make sense when it comes to identifying these very types of issues. But again, it's just one piece of the puzzle. So I want to talk about some other things real quick around sort of best practices, and John will jump in here as well. But these are things that just go beyond applying, tools and just trying to solve the problem with technology. It's really kind of an approach that you would take to making sure that you're comprehensively looking at security across your containerized platform, and making sure that you're really doing the things that are expected of you, whether it's because of compliance, security, or otherwise. So obviously, step one is permissions, making sure that you understand who's got access to the system, making sure you understand, really what level of access they're going to have. So with any processes or with any individuals, you want to have the lowest level of privilege as possible. And I think that would have prevented some of the stuff that we've observed in some of our customer environments, because they do have some, we've had some experiences with customers running things with some higher privileges that ultimately led to some problems. So, kind of that fundamental best practices, run things at the lowest possible privilege as much as you can, and that tends to really cut out a lot of noise. John, I don't know if you want to add anything to that or not.
No, I mean that's absolutely true. And just like anything else, you're going to have issues. You're going to have incidents pop up. And another consideration that you probably want to throw in this along with the permissions point is, with the IDS, with log, all the automation you do, everything that you're doing in your environment, having a thoughtful incident action, response plan is also super important. Once you're able to kind of identify what's happening, being able to, quickly cut off that attack and then remediate, having a thoughtful, incident management plan is a must for everyone. I mean, that's key in being able to handle any of these kind of security issues that may pop up.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really kind of hitting on the second point there. And IDS and log monitoring is a pretty, broad topic, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But ultimately, you're looking for things that you want to be able to analyze and validate that it either should be there or it shouldn't be there. And with logs, one of the things that we're able to do with our container solution now, other than collect just network traffic, is that we can collect container application logs. So people are using that same container to collect both. So they deploy a single container on that host. It collects network traffic so we can do the analysis there. It collects container application logs so we can see what's actually happening with the applications that are running in those containers. And that could be, custom homegrown applications that people tend to run, or it could be a variety of different third-party applications that we already collect and actually have parsing rules for. So there's a lot that you can dig in, both from the standpoint of pre and post compromise activity that you can look at from that kind of information. And to John's point, that leads to having a really good actionable plan depending upon the type of breach, depending upon the types of systems that were targeted, and then being able to make sure that you understand the spread factor of that and the scope of that breach as well. So getting the right experts on your side, it's like security in general. This stuff can get pretty focused. You want to make sure that you have people either within your organization or people that you outsource services to that understand how these things work. It's the same kind of process that customers went when they started first migrating to the cloud. They needed to find people that had done that before. They needed to make sure that they were working with resources that could help them migrate their applications to a cloud-based operation versus the traditional data center. So making sure that you've got that vendors and staff that have used these types of tools, if you're going down this path, is important. And making sure that not only do they understand how they work, but within that understanding of how they work, they get a better understanding of how to secure those types of applications and containers specifically. So that's really important that you have the right partners on your side to help you secure these environments, because it can get pretty difficult. And these attack vectors change pretty consistently here, just like they do everywhere else. And this kind of also kind of goes back to the whole thing I just talked about making sure that you understand how you can migrate these things. Portability is key. So, being able to deploy containers in this specific case across multiple platforms, whether, we're seeing some customers that are mixing things up and deploying things in AWS and Azure. Some have deployed in Google. Some are straight, one cloud over another. And we've actually had a few customers who have deployed containers on premise, and they're using a mix of VMware and Kubernetes and Docker and those types of things. The good thing is that we can secure any of those environments, whether we're talking AWS, Azure, Google, on-prem. This solution would work anywhere because it's deployed just like any other container would deploy it. So you have to make sure that you're able to secure these applications and do so no matter where you're deploying them. Backing things up is obviously key. I don't think I needed to go too far into that, but I think that one of the things that's important is to make sure that you're aware of developmental changes. This certainly helps you from a security standpoint, because if an image is compromised or a vulnerability is identified on an image, you want to make sure that you understand when changes were made. So you can either backport to an image, or you can make a change to a newly rolled out image at the image level, and then get that pushed out to production broadly and very, very quickly. So, John, is there anything that you'd like to add around that side of it?
No, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there, where the key thing here is being able to deploy from that image very, very quickly is probably the most important thing. There's a lot of hurdles that people trip when they first get into the container world, where they'll get in, they'll start working with a container that is deployed, and they'll be working with it straight at the image or at the container as it's running in production, making changes to it, that kind of thing. That's kind of a bit of a bad practice. So being able to make sure that you've got all of that built into your images, and that you're actually your continuous delivery process is the one that's taking those images, laying the software on, and then deploying that, so that your software and the image itself is part of your backup strategy.
Yeah, that's very true. And I think that, when it comes to pulling down trusted software, I mean, you just have to make sure that you're validating where you're getting it from. When it comes to containerized workloads, many people are going straight to what's called the Docker Hub. There's a lot of validated vendors that are up there that have different types of software applications that serve a number of different purposes. But just like you're pulling down packages for other types of software that you run, you want to make sure things are signed and that the vendor's trusted and you know who they are. So otherwise, you can get yourself into a whole lot of trouble that we've seen in other cases. Limiting system resources. These two points really kind of play well or play off of each other in terms of a healthy host is a happy host. Resources, containers are intended to be single process systems, and so you want them to be lightweight, you want them to be portable, you want them to be scalable, and it's important that you're not overwhelming the underlying host and those types of things with too much activity, and putting them in a situation where they could be overwhelmed with requests, and maybe even put in a situation where they're in an insecure portion of the environment that allows them to be subjected to certain types of attacks. One of the ways that you can make sure that you're staying on top of this is by doing process monitoring within these containers to make sure that you understand when valid processes are running, you are aware when rogue processes start up. And so that's a really important and an effective way to make sure that containers are able to run optimally, but you're also able to identify potential security issues by, again, rogue processes that start unexpectedly and sort of come out of nowhere. And thinking big picture security, you don't want to do things in a silo approach. You want to basically try to make sure that whether you're doing this for a development environment or you're running this like within your production environment, that you've got really the same practice across the board. There's no reason not to secure your development environment, and it's very easy to do so with technologies like this, since the deployment of containers is really, really easy for the most part if you set it up working with the right deployment tools and DevOps tools. Then ideally you can find security solutions to help you do different types of security applications, and do so in a way that's efficient, do it very quickly, and that way it makes it a lot more palatable for you to say, hey, I'm going to deploy this in my development environment just in case, the same way that we do in production. And then there's that way you also have one rule book and one playbook that you're going to manage security. There's no exceptions because exceptions will certainly lead to problems. As it relates to getting more familiar with the community itself, there's a lot of great resources out there. Docker has been tremendous, in terms of the documentation that they put together, the resources and networking they've done between organizations that are container focused. AWS has done a tremendous amount. They've got dedicated services for containers, just as does Azure does as well. Google has their own version of a Kubernetes service. All of these organizations have support forums, and they have different types of things you can go to pull down documentation. And certainly working with vendors that are tied into containers, they can plug you into those very same things and teach you a lot about what's going on as well. For us, we can be a source of information for you as well. So we've got a best practices guide and workbook that you can find at www.alertlogic.com/containers. There's a lot of good information that's contained in there that sort of goes through what we talked about at a deeper level than what we covered here, of course. There's also opportunities for you to pull down the blog posts by medium. You can also pull down the white paper that we did on the breach that we covered today in the webinar. So there's a lot of information that you can grab and will give you further insight into some of the things that we discussed. But now I think that that's the content that we got prepared, and we wanted to bring in Tyson now for Q&A.
Yeah, great. Wow, good stuff, guys. Yes, as I mentioned at the top of the webinar, we also have Tyson Malik, who's Senior Manager, DevOps Cloud Release and Middleware Engineering at Rent-A-Center. And hopefully Tyson is going to tell us a little bit about, start off by telling us a little bit about Rent-A-Center, and then maybe tell us a little bit about his container issues and challenges and his environment there at Rent-A-Center. So Tyson, why don't we go ahead and get started by you telling us a little bit about Rent-A-Center?
Sure, good to be with you. So Rent-A-Center is a rent-to-own provider. So we let you enjoy big ticket items, furniture, computers, appliances without paying full price up front. There's no credit needed and no long-term commitments. We have over 2,200 stores across the U.S., Puerto Rico, and Mexico, and then another line of business where we go into other stores, and if you're turned down for their credit as another option, they offer you a rent-own agreement through Rent-A-Center. It's our Acceptance Now brand. As far as our IT department, we're definitely a cloud-first company. We're constantly evaluating, which apps make sense to move to the cloud, and when we start any new project, we're definitely looking to the cloud first, whether that's a SaaS solution or developing our own apps to run, in the cloud. The title there is kind of long. My real focus is mostly on the DevOps cloud side of things. Really my focus in the role is making sure that we're doing everything, kind of utilizing that infrastructure as code mentality, mainly through CloudFormation on AWS. We really try to run our operations team just like our development teams. So everything's checked into source control, deployed via Jenkins, etc. It's really allowed us to build new environments really quickly and scale them even quicker. So that's kind of the high-level view of Rent-A-Center and kind of my role there in the IT department.
Okay, great. So let's talk a little bit about Rent-A-Center's container journey. Can you kind of give us an idea of what it's looked like so far, and how you guys and when you guys got started with the containers?
Sure. We started probably, I would say, first developing, using Docker containers about 3 years ago. When we were about to introduce a new e-commerce site. I think Rent-A-Center actually became one of the first, if not the first, to deploy the SAP Hybris e-commerce suite fully on Docker containers running in AWS. So I think it's probably not the traditional use case for Docker because SAP Hybris is somewhat of a kind of fat monolithic system. It's not your microservices that you'd think that you'd put on Docker. But we were looking for that ease of portability and scalability that we thought we could achieve with Docker. So we kind of jumped in. That definitely presented a lot of challenges, not only being new to Docker, but also some engineering challenges just with making SAP Hybris work inside Docker. So a lot of collaboration with SAP Hybris as well as AWS to make that work. If anyone's interested, Google Rent-A-Center and Docker, and you'll be probably surprised to see how much information comes up there. Some talks we did at AWS reInvent, some AWS case studies, and other information about how we were able to achieve that. Since then, we've really moved, dozens more apps, more not as big as our e-commerce suite, but some of our standalone job apps onto Docker in AWS. Majority, are Tomcat application servers running inside of Docker.
All right, great. So you mentioned AWS and Docker as kind of platform combinations. Are you using any others, or do you have any plans to use any others in the future?
Definitely, we're looking at it. Currently, we're running mostly Docker on EC2 hosts, utilizing the ECS and ECR services in AWS. We've actually started to utilize the Fargate service in AWS for a number of our newer apps. That's really allowed us to minimize, the maintenance on those EC2 hosts and let AWS do more of the heavy lifting, so to speak. And we've started to explore Kubernetes a little bit, mostly just from a research perspective. We haven't implemented anything yet. We're still a little new on our Fargate journey, so we think that can get us where we want to go in the short term. But definitely, we're going to explore Kubernetes as well. We are mostly an AWS shop. Definitely, we have some Azure available to us. Obviously, everybody does, but definitely we've looked at, does it make sense to start exploring another cloud provider just to make sure we're not, kind of having that vendor lock in.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. That's always a huge consideration. So, thinking about today's webinar and the information that Alert Logic has presented regarding the expanded container security offering, I'm curious to get your thoughts on that, and what your opinion is on it in general.
Yeah, sure. I mean, as an Alert Logic customer, first off, we've been impressed with the real-time visibility that we're getting with our stuff hosted on AWS. I think that managed threat protection is something that we don't have the experts in-house, and letting someone else kind of managing that for you has been a big win for us. As far as their new offering, I think the biggest thing that jumps out to me is just moving to different platforms, whether it's Azure or wherever else, knowing that now that we're using Docker pretty extensively. Obviously, big reason is portability. So if they're offering a wider range of cloud platforms, that gives us the same, making security kind of as portable as our containers are. So excited about that. Excited about the the new container log management capabilities, and seeing how we can utilize that. I think that's probably the thing that jumps out at me most about the new announcement.
All right, great. Well, Tyson, thanks very much for sharing your expertise and your opinion. Good stuff there. So thanks very much. I'm sure the audience got a lot out of it. So thanks again. And at this point, I do want to open up the question and answer period for the audience. We've gotten a ton of great questions in so far. So, but there is plenty of time for more questions. If you have one, go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions, and we will get to as many as we can before the top of the hour. So first question, what rules do you use to decide if a repo is trusted or not? Matt or John?
So yeah, I can try to take a stab at this one. So as far as like what rules that we do internally from our infrastructure, this is Alert Logic has some folks who deploy some internal container technologies ourselves. We actually have to do a whole lot of digging into any external repos that we pull in. By and large, we are not allowed to reach out and pull in just any random repo. It actually has to go through an internal approval process for us. So, our own security and compliance requirements kind of get layered on top of what we have to do as a company from our infrastructure perspective for what we're allowed to pull in. So, they have to go through an internal inspection by a security compliance team. They have to get on the approved list. There's a couple of other things that kind of have to happen just to make sure that, as developers are starting to build internal images for things, they've got a list of things that are pre-approved and are allowed to run. That's essentially the rules that we kind of apply internally for what external repos we're allowed to pull from.
Okay, great. Next question, and I think this harkens back to the slide deck earlier, the incident with the getting hacked. But the question is, how was Kubernetes hacked to allow a container to be started to do mining?
Yeah, so that was a mix of a couple of different things. It was the default networking itself was by default, Kubernetes is not that secure with the way, so you have to kind of modify what things have access to. But the bigger sin for this particular issue that we observed was the fact that somebody had made a change to the configuration that allowed inbound access, and that's ultimately what enabled an attacker, as they're scanning, an environment. In this case, I believe it was AWS, looking for open ports. They realized they had inbound access all the way into this cluster. So this was a simple configuration change at the perimeter that was a mistake that opened it right up, and they probably had, if I recall correctly, a few things are running with too high a level of privilege, which also contributed to the fact they were able to install things and do things they were you wouldn't want them to do. So it was a mix of really those two things that caused this specific problem.
Yeah, and to kind of add to that, essentially what ended up happening because of that escalated privilege capability, they actually were able to get into a running container and get to a shell, and then misbehave on that container.
That's a good way of putting it. Misbehave. Okay, great. Next question. How do you know if a network intrusion targets your containers?
Well, that's really what we had to do with building our solution to collect network traffic. So again, most of the containerized solutions out there from a security standpoint are doing some really important things, but none of it really has much to do with network traffic. It's monitoring, what processes are running. It's doing vulnerability scanning both at build time and if a customer wants it at runtime. It is being able to do configuration analysis and determine if there's something that is improperly configured there. But no one had really figured out or has at this point in the time had released a product that was focused on collecting network traffic that was targeting containers, that observed traffic between containers, as well as the traffic that targeted the base host. So given that a fundamental security technology that we utilize in our own suite of services is around intrusion detection, we needed to figure out how to solve that problem. We needed to figure out how to extract traffic from these containerized workloads so that we could do the same type of inspection of traffic there that we do, whether we're talking about traditional AWS instances or we're talking about collecting or getting traffic from span ports and data centers. This was just another way that people are deploying their technologies, and we had to figure out how to get in and collect that traffic. So that's how you do it. You have to deploy a container that can give you that level of visibility. What our container effectively does is as it's deployed in parallel to the other containers on a host, it binds to the Docker 0 bridge interface where all the traffic effectively gets trunked. We're able to see all that traffic, and between collecting it and then also pulling the Docker API, which gives us critical metadata about what each of those containers are and their identities and all that good stuff, we're able to present that in our interface to our customers so they can see, if any events get triggered that may be targeting those containers. So that's really how you do it. That's the only way that you can really do intrusion detection, is by gathering that traffic somehow. And that was the problem that we set out to solve over the last year or so.
All right, great. Next question. Does alert logic present a consistent API when deployed across infrastructure as a service and internal clouds?
Yeah, actually, we do. The interesting way in which we're deployed, the way that our solution works, is it deploys into an environment just like any other container. So it's a container that runs. You're not required to have anything else deployed internally into that infrastructure outside of our container, and then our appliance. So as Matt was highlighting, what our container does is it collects all that data, gets analyzed by the appliance, comes back to us. We actually store all that data, and we run a whole lot of analytics on it. We create events and incidents, So we actually have a very standard API because we're a SaaS provider, because we pull all that data back to us. We expose those APIs to our customers. So you can either look at what has happened to your environment through the UI by looking at incidents, and kind of what other assets within your environment were part of that incident. We kind of show that to you as well. Or if you are the kind of a shop that likes to pull stuff from an API and grok that on your own, we have a very standard API that you could pull all of that from as well.
Wonderful. Okay, great. Next question. But before I do, just want to remind the audience that we do have plenty of time for questions. So if you have a question, go ahead and just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit it. We'll move on to the next question now, which is, what additional security does Kubernetes or Docker Swarm provide to the Docker containers?
Not a whole lot. Kubernetes itself doesn't really provide security much. It's more about orchestration and networking and just making deployment easier and all that good stuff. I mean, there's some fundamental things I think that are part of it, but nothing that's I would call enhanced. Docker Swarm is another, orchestration tool. I think there's some encapsulation that may be there. I don't recall, John may recall, if there's an encryption option that could be added or utilized by Swarm. You've got some technologies out there like Rancher, which, these are all typically orchestration tools that run on top of Docker or run on top of Kubernetes on top of Docker. People have a variety of different ways that they're deploying these containers and the different types of networking and orchestration tools that they're using. Some of them provide, encryption on top of the traffic, so everything that's being sent within the environment gets encrypted. But I mean, that covers you from the standpoint of being able to, I guess, be able to have the traffic picked off the wire in clear text, but it certainly also can make it difficult for you to actually know what's going on in those environments if they're all encrypted as well. So you have to figure out what you're encrypting, where you're encrypting it, and making sure that it doesn't blind you to some issues that go on. For us, we have the ability in many cases to decrypt encrypted traffic depending upon what protocols are being used and how it's done. But ultimately, what we're about here with this solution is about visibility, right? Making sure that we can, get the information that so far has been pretty elusive when it comes to analyzing network traffic around containers.
All right, great. So our next question then is, does Alert Logic offer secure access to a particular application hosted on Docker in addition to network layer security?
So I think the question is around application specific security, maybe, or
it says secure access to a particular application hosted on Docker, and then in addition to network layer.
Yeah, not a specific application itself. I mean, I think what we do is we collect logs from those applications. And it's not necessarily a specific application or a targeted group of applications. We're collecting logs from really any container application that is running in that container. And so what we'd likely do around that is make sure that we have parsing for those messages, which again could be third-party applications that are run there, or they could be custom applications, in which if they are custom applications that are homegrown, we would need to figure out what is important from the standpoint of security in those messages and make sure that we could parse those. And we would go down the path of providing, security through log analysis on those applications. But we don't target any specific application that runs on Docker. For us, it's if whatever they're running in there, we can pull the data that's being generated and we can provide analysis on it. The only real work that I see us having to do is if there are specific messages that a customer would be concerned about, that they want to make sure that they can create incidents for and have normalization on, and there would be some content work needed for that, for anything that's homegrown. But outside of that, we should be able to collect logs from any of the applications that they're running in there without issue.
Okay, great. Next question. The webinar mentioned microservices a lot, but made no mention about AWS Lambda, the leading microservices service. Can you say more about whether Alert Logic can monitor AWS Lambda instances?
So today, we cannot. As a matter of fact, it's kind of it's a bit of a problem across the security industry at the moment. And you know, Matt can talk a bit more about this from the product side, but we do have some discussions with AWS. I mean, we are a big AWS partner. You know, where we're going to be looking into how to better provide security for those workloads. You know, workloads like Fargate, things that are you know, at the heart of containers, at the heart of microservices, but you know, there hasn't been a super solid security story wrapped around yet.
Okay. All right. Great. Well, next question then is, how does Alert Logic differ from other container security vendors in the market?
It's, you know, there's some overlap in some areas. We're unique from the standpoint of collecting network traffic and being able to analyze that from containers. So from our research and from what we're seeing in the market and hearing from market analysts, we're the only solution that does that piece of it. Where we have some overlap with others is that we do collect logs from containerized applications, as we mentioned. So there are certain vendors that do that, and we are, you know, just getting into rounding out some features that are going to be coming over the next 6 months. So that will include things like vulnerability scanning, predominantly at build time, so we can make sure that images are secure before they get rolled out into production. And enabling customers to do that through our interface through the same mechanisms. We are looking at doing things like traffic monitoring as well, so we can make sure that we're, you know, keenly aware of changes in traffic volume. We will be doing security monitoring from the standpoint of understanding, you know, user auditing and configuration auditing, making sure that we are aware of what levels of privileges certain types of systems have. So these are some things that we're looking at as well, and finally process monitoring as well. So this is something that we want to bring to our portfolio beyond just collecting logs and collecting network traffic and building security instance out of that. We want to get into the scanning, we want to get into process monitoring, and these are things we have plans for. Most of the market out there tends to fall into the process monitoring, vulnerability scanning, configuration auditing pillars. That's where you really see most of the activity historically with containers security itself. I don't think I'm missing anything, John, but if I am, feel free to add to that.
No, I think you kind of locked all that in.
All right then, great. We are just doing a quick time check. We're about 8 minutes to the top of the hour, so I think we have time for 2 or 3 more questions. Next question, can you comment about the size of the container logs? Aren't these container logs huge and hard to manage?
Yeah, so it's true they are, but at the heart of Alert Logic, kind of one of the other things that we are quite good at is log management, at least from a security perspective. So what happens with the solution when you deploy it and we're pulling off those container application logs? They're not actually staying. We're not keeping them there locally. We're pulling them off to our data processing and analytics platform. And we've actually, we scale that massively. There's, you can actually go find on reInvent last year a talk that our chief architect did about how we do log management at Alert Logic. And it's kind of impressive to see how much data we can actually ingest and how much we can run through analytics and provide you security details around the logs that we're collecting, and even be able to provide you know, connection between an IDS event or an incident that happened, as well as the log data itself. They're going to help draw the picture of the whole you know, security incident itself from start to finish.
All right, awesome. Next question, if I wanted to manually test or verify the security of a container someone had set up in an environment, what would be the top tests I'd undertake that may be missed by tools or hard to check for?
So I think there's some common things that are out there. You can run through a series of different tests. Actually, there's, you know, running them through, there's a CIS benchmark test that exists that Docker has. We run those as internal checks to make sure we didn't miss anything crazy. But at least from our approach, one of the things that we do from our containers, and specifically even our own the container that we ship, is we test heavily, being able to make sure that we cannot actually get into the shell at all. So we make sure that we validate that hasn't happened, that hasn't broken, and that at least at that layer of security from being able to gain that initial entry, we don't allow. So we run through that test within our container that we release as a product, as well as all of our internal infrastructure as well.
All right, great. Let's see, looking here, question, does Alert Logic take care of container registry security or container runtime security?
So the registry security is kind of one of those things that's on our roadmap. The runtime security, you betcha. That's really what we're looking at right now. So today with our solution, we're able to look at network intrusion detection, we're able to collect logs, and we're also able to execute runtime scans, so vulnerability scans. So all the kind of runtime perspectives from that point of view, there's a series of other things that we're putting on our roadmap to be adding over the, next, several months that builds upon that. But yeah, we definitely are able to validate that stuff runtime.
Okay. Great. I think we got time for one or two more questions. Is there any other security standard against which Alert Logic benchmarks apart from CIS?
For us internally, that is pretty much our standard. We're kind of not very nice to ourselves when it comes to CIS benchmark standards. We require most of them to be to pass. So if you actually sit down and you go through an actual test like a true CIS benchmark, it's hard to pass it. The other thing that we also do is anytime we make changes to anything that we ship externally, we do contract folks to do any type of code analysis, penetration testing. We run it through a series of pretty considerable security checks that are even outside of our own organization to make sure that what we're releasing is as secure as possible.
Okay, great. So I think we have time for one more question, which is, what are some good intrusion detection tools?
Alert Logic.
Yeah, I mean, we're very proud of our own. I mean, as it relates to containers, there's not another option out there yet for intrusion detection that we've seen. So if it's specific to containerized workloads, we would be the folks you'd want to give a call to. Beyond the landscape of containers, there's a bunch of different vendors out there. Some of them that are purely technology vendors that make pretty good stuff that require you to know how to deploy it, know how to manage it, know how to analyze it, all that good stuff. You've got MSSPs that will either manage a mix of their own IDSs with services, or they're just pure services plays that are managing third-party IDSs out there. So it really kind of depends upon what your needs are. Generally speaking, you can make decisions between IPS and IDS. They've got they both have their purposes, and they both can be good technologies. You have considerations you have to think about, like, how much encryption do we have within our environment? Is that just at the perimeter? Does that permeate all the way to the desktop? That will potentially cause issues for IDSs depending upon what encryption protocols are there. So you have to really think about the kind of tools that you're using before you decide on any one technology. But specific to containers, as best we can tell, our Alert Logic's the only option for an intrusion detection solution around that.
All right, great, perfect timing. We are about a minute to the top of the hour, so we have to close out question and answer period now, but I do want to thank everybody who did submit a question. And if we didn't get to your question, I'm very sorry. We just ran out of time, but just know that the Alert Logic folks will get a copy of all the questions that came in. So I'm sure they'll be more than happy to get in touch with you offline and discuss it with you. Want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of the webinar, you will be receiving an email post-event that will contain a link to access the webinar on demand. Also, the website will be on the DevOps.com website. So if you don't get the email or whatever, you just want to look on the DevOps.com website for the webinar, that's fine. Just go to webinars on demand, and it should be sitting there, right there waiting for you. While you're there, just check out some of the other webinars that we have both upcoming and on demand. Hopefully there'll be one or two that pique your interest. Matt and John and Tyson, all three of you, thank you so much for joining me today and giving such a great presentation. I'm sure the audience got a lot out of it.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you.
All right, excellent. Well, this is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody.